to the third session of SAT Verbal, where we're about to solve the third passage on the March 2020 SAT test. Once again, once you've read the blurb, you could go ahead with any reading strategy that you're comfortable with. I am about to move directly to the questions. Looking for a line reference one, which I can see is my very first question. Which situation is most similar to that described in? Okay, we're looking for an analogy here. For the ones who've read the passage already, read only lines 10 to 13. For the rest of you, read at least 5 lines above and 5 lines below to get a better idea. Much like photosynthesis or vitamin D production, it's a trade-off. In the frog's case, faster development in a higher risk environment, alright? Male elk that expends energy, nothing about expending energy as such. Deer that forages in an area with plentiful resources, yes. Proximity to predators, high risk environment, we may hold on to it. Bird that experiences rapid bone growth while losing strength, nothing about losing anything here. Turtle that produces small clutch of eggs because resources are scarce, nothing about resource being scarce either. These my answer. And we can now move on to 26 as used in line 61. Experience most nearly means, so that's a vocab and context question. 61. Interested in other ways frogs might experience DNA damage. They studied the effects of, okay. So basically, again, for the ones who haven't read the passage, maybe read 3 lines above and 3 lines below to get a better understanding. My prediction would be something along the lines of frogs facing this damage, and undergo does match facing, practice no, withstand could be the case, somewhat true, but mostly not, because withstand also has an element of being able to fight the same, which is out of scope here. Feel no, therefore my answer would be undergo. And with that, I'm going to move on to 29. As used in line 72, confirm most nearly means, okay? So let's go back to 72. Until enzyme concentrations are confirmed. This doesn't really give me much of an understanding, so I'm going to go back by a few lines and read a little bit more. Turns out that high altitude frogs had less VAP-induced DNA damage compared with their lowland cousins. Added protection by DNA photolysis, maybe, until enzyme concentrations are confirmed. Okay, so something along the lines of test results being brought in. That would be the phrase that I'm going with. Administered no. Approved. This is not exactly, about being able to find a result that they're looking for. So no. Verified could very well be the case. Strengthened no. Therefore, my answer would be verified here. Approve is a close call, but they don't really want to approve of the same. Therefore, that's out of scope. And with that, we can move on to our paired questions. 24 and 25. Based on the passage, it can most reasonably be inferred from the research conducted in the French Alps. I want to infer something about the research. 47 to 49. Okay. Question was answered in part by researchers working with a single species of frogs inhabiting different altitudes of the French Alps. Okay, let's see if we find a match to this one. Living at higher altitudes affects larval growth and development. High levels of UVB exposure cause lethal effects at all altitudes. DNA photolysis. Concentrations are naturally higher in the species of frog that was studied. Tolerance to UVB exposure can vary within a species. Doesn't seem like there is a match. Moving on to 49 to 54. So frog populations adapted to life at higher altitudes, and therefore naturally higher UVB exposures showed less DNA damage than did their lower altitude brethren. when exposed to UVB intensities typical of high altitude. Okay, that does look like D. Tolerance to UVB exposure can vary within a species because we're talking about frogs living in different altitudes. So there is a match for this one. Moving on to 54 to 56. Identifying the genetic mechanism of this adaptation, rapid evolution, increased protein production, or both will require further study. Something about further inspection. Do we have a match? Not exactly, so we can eliminate C as well. 57 to 60 now. Although DNA photolysed concentrations were not measured, the authors report an interesting twist that suggests increased photolysed activity in high altitude tadpoles. Okay. Sounds dangerously close to C, but not quite, because not all frogs that were studied had naturally higher DNA photolysed. Therefore, although C and D are matches as well, D for 24 and B from 25 are my answers. And our next pair would be 27 and 28. Can reasonably be inferred from the passage that if further research demonstrated that DNA photolysed protected the high altitude frogs from BAP-induced DNA damage, then Pacific tree frogs should. Something about Pacific tree frogs. 25 to 31. Their study reveals strong positive correlations between UVB-resistant frog species, a species, for example, whose eggs are normally most exposed to sunlight because they are laid in sunny, shallow ponds and increase photolysed activity in comparison to species whose eggs tend to be protected from direct sunlight. Okay. Do we have a match? Demonstrate a similar ability to cope, thrive in high altitude, exhibit BAP-induced DNA damage. Nothing about altitudes here. Kinks in their DNA helix, so we can't find a match. Gonna move back to 43 to 46 now. Their findings raise an intriguing question. Are less resistant species more susceptible to DNA damage caused by increased UVB? Okay. Let's see if we have a match. Nothing about altitudes either. Tadpoles, clear evidence demonstrates similar ability to cope with. Okay. Once again, don't exactly find a match, so we're going to move to 60 to 64 now. Interest in other ways frogs might experience DNA damage. They studied the effects of benzopyrene, a well-characterized carcinogen present in cigarette smoke, coal tar oil, and myriad other combustion products. Alright. Sort of matches A. Demonstrate a similar ability to cope with BAP pollution in their environment. don't know if there's a similar ability exactly. They wanted to find out, which is why the research was conducted, but nobody knows whether there was a similar ability exactly. So although A and C are sort of matching, they are not my answers. Finally, reading 66 and 70. So I'm going to read between 66 and 70. Hopefully we're going to find what we're looking for, otherwise we'll have to go back and read the lines again. Activated BAP binds with DNA, causing a kink in the DNA helix, just like UVB. A specialty of DNA photolysed is kinky DNA. It turns out that high-altitude frogs had less BAP-induced DNA damage compared with their OK. So we definitely have a match for this one. So D is going to match with A, in fact. So demonstrating a similar ability to cope with BAP pollution. So A and D are my answers here. Okay, now we're going to move on to our synthesis questions. So which statement is best supported by the data in figure 1? So we've got to go and look at figure 1. It's important to read the title, to read the headers, units if any. So we are dealing with photolysed activity and egg-laying location, exposure to sunlight in selected amphibian species. Dealing with frogs and salamanders here. Specific photolysed activity and their egg-laying location, exposure to sunlight. We can clearly see that the more unexposed they are, the less is their photolysed activity. So they are inversely proportional. Okay. So only those amphibian species with photolysed activity less than or equal to 0.7 lay their eggs where there is no exposure to sunlight. Okay, let's find out. Less than 0.7. Hidden exposed logs or that is true, so we can hold on to it. Let's look at B. All amphibian species with photolysed activity greater than 3.5 lay their eggs in locations with high exposure to sunlight, greater than 3.5. Okay. So attached to submerged stem variable exposure. So exposure is variable. Therefore, it's somewhat true, not completely. So we call these sort of answer choices mostly, slightly true, mostly false. Or mostly right, slightly wrong. Moving on to C. Only these amphibian species with photolysed activity of 7.5 or greater lay their eggs in areas with variable exposure to sunlight. That is definitely not true. We know that from the table. In all amphibian species with photolysed activity of 1.0 or greater lay their eggs in open shallow. That's also not true because it's more than 7. Okay. So my answer is A here, and we're going to move on. According to figure 1, which species lays eggs in locations with the greatest exposure to sunlight? That would be simple because here it is, Hydra regular. So easy enough questions. Easy enough question, this one. This is an easy enough question. So after that, we're going to move on to 32. Which data from figure 2 appear to be inconsistent with the researchers' observations about the frog populations in the French Alps as presented in the passage? This is an easy question because you want to be looking for information that's inconsistent with the passage. So if you know what the passage says, let's go find out what's inconsistent with the passage first. Since it's a synthesis question, so you want to synthesize both the passage as well as your data, as well as your figure, that is, to be able to find the answer. So population at 800 meters above sea level without UVB exposure experienced less DNA damage than did the population at 450 meters above sea level without UVB exposure. Seems like, could be true. population, that means it's not, sorry, I want to do this again. Okay, now we're going to move on to 32, which is another synthesis question. Which data from figure 2 appear to be inconsistent with the researchers' observations about the frog populations in the French Alps as presented in the passage? Okay, she's looking for information that's inconsistent with the passage. It's a synthesis question because we are synthesizing both the passage as well as the figure in order to find the answer. Inconsistent is the word to look for, so we want to look for information that's false, that doesn't match what's written in the passage. So population at 800 meters above sea level without UVB exposure experienced less DNA damage than did the population at 450 meters above sea level without UVB. That looks like true, so it's not my answer. Population at 410 meters above sea level without UVB exposure experienced less DNA damage than did the population at 410 meters above sea level with UVB exposure. None of this is even mentioned in the passage. We do not know what happens when they are at an equal altitude. Moving on, population at 800 meters above sea level with UVB exposure experienced more DNA damage than did the population. Inconsistent, yes, because more the altitude, higher the altitude, less the DNA damage, because you are prone to such situations by then. Population at 450 meters above sea level with UVB exposure experienced more DNA damage than did the population at 2,450 meters above sea level with UVB exposure. Okay, this slightly throws me off. So let's now go to the figure and find whether the answer is C or D. So is it population at 800 meters above sea level with UVB exposure experiencing more DNA damage than did the population at 294 meters above sea level with UVB exposure? Okay, 800 meters and 294 meters. $800 meters and 294 meters here. So it's definitely present. It looks like a viable answer, but we want to check D as well. 450 with UVB exposure and 2,450 with UVB exposure. So that's not true. It's in fact less. It's not more. Therefore, my answer is C. And now we can move to the general questions. Scouring through, we only have one question left here. The passage indicates that burrowing in mud may benefit some amphibians by delaying egg hatching and larval development. Well, we do not have any indication about the same, so by now it's expected that you've mostly read the passage and the tables. You should be able to answer this. Repairing damage caused by UVB burrowing in mud. Well, we do not know about this either. Limiting exposure to sunlight, definitely. Reducing need to produce sunscreen, we do not exactly know whether that is the case, therefore C is my answer. So this is the way you solve questions, especially synthesis questions in any given passage. Moving quickly through the line reference questions first before moving on to the synthesis questions and finally the general questions. Again, if you like this video, do like, share and subscribe to our page so we can, keep making more videos to help you ace the SAT. Have a great day.